All right, I think we're almost there. Okay. All right, hello everyone. My name is Rachel Zamont and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the Spondylitis Association of America. Thank you for joining us for this live discussion on COVID-19 vaccines and spondyloarthritis. We're welcoming two incredible guest speakers today, starting first with Dr. James Rosenbaum, Professor of Medicine at the Division of Arthritis and Rheumatic Diseases, as well as Professor of Ophthalmology at Oregon Health and Science University. And a little bit later on, we'll be welcoming Dr. Kevin Winthrop, Professor of Infectious Diseases, Public Health, and Ophthalmology at OHSU, and former infectious disease epidemiologist at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We can't thank our wonderful speakers enough for offering your time and expertise today. We've gotten many questions emailed to us ahead of time, and so we'll start with those. We'll also ask some questions from our live audience as they come in, and of course, try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. So let's begin with some background information on the vaccines that are pending approval in the US. There's a lot we still don't know, so I just want to preface our conversation by saying that we'll discuss what is currently known, and some questions may not yet have answers. Does that sound good?
Perfect. And Dr. Winthrop has joined, so.
Hello, Dr. Winthrop.
Sorry,
thank you so much.
I'm running from one thing to the next. And
of course, no problem at all.
Your time is impeccable.
Yes. All right, so let's begin. So as we understand, there are three types of vaccines now being developed for COVID-19, and these are mRNA vaccines, protein subunit vaccines, and vector vaccines. Can you please give some background information on each type of vaccine and discuss the differences between the specific vaccines that could hit the market, and especially the front runner, the Pfizer vaccine?
Kevin, I'll defer to you since you're the vaccine expert.
Well, maybe I'll just, I'll talk about the front runner first, since I just was in a meeting with Pfizer as of 4 minutes ago. So, and actually I was giving grand rounds in Leeds this morning at their regional consultant meeting in the UK, where they had just given their first vaccinations with the Pfizer vaccine. So they actually had some real experience. So if you saw this morning, there was a couple anaphylactic reactions in England, and their regulatory agency then immediately warned, oh, well, maybe the vaccine's not good for people who have a history of, a lot of hypersensitivity or anaphylactic reactions. So I'm sure you'll have questions about that, and we'll have to think about that as we go. But that vaccine is, probably the front runner in terms of the first one to be distributed. Its efficacy looks around 90%, and it's similar to at least the Mrna vaccine that also has about a similar efficacy. Those two vaccines are similar in terms of being mRNA vaccines. So what that is a piece of viral RNA, which is genetic material. It gets injected, it gets picked up by your immune cells, and in those cells, then it undergoes replication and produces some of the spike proteins of the virus. And then those spike proteins are seen by your immune system, and you create an immune response to it. So you build antibodies, and your white blood cells develop a memory response as well to it. So that's the basis for their protection. They're fairly new. It's a new platform. I mean, there's not another approved mRNA vaccine out there. So it's new. And but there's multiple ones in development for COVID, and those are the two that are the front runners. The other one you mentioned was a vector vaccine, and those are primarily adenoviral vectors. So adenoviruses are, just been, fairly benign. There's lots of different adenoviruses. Some actually are not benign. They're a problem, and they make you sick. But a lot of them are not ones that make you sick. And we've been exposed. We, meaning all of us humans, have been exposed to probably hundreds of them. I don't even know. So they take, the makers of these vaccines take very, basically non-pathogenic adenoviral viruses, ones that don't cause any illness at all, and they put the genetic sequences of the the COVID or the coronavirus in those adenoviruses. So when they give it to a human, basically you get infected with this adenovirus. It's benign. It doesn't cause any problems, but then it replicates the virus. It replicates a certain part of the coronavirus, like the spike protein. And then again, your body sees it, creates an immune response, and then you're protected. So it's pretty similar to an RNA vaccine. It's just a different, it's one step upstream, I guess, Jim. That sounds right to you. Sure. Or maybe downstream. I don't know. It depends where the river.
Parallel stream.
Yeah, exactly. So those are live vaccines, but they're not live in that you can't take them if you're immunocompromised, because they don't cause any, illness at all. So even if you're immunocompromised by, let's say you're on some biologic or something, you can still take those vaccines. It's not a problem. And the last one is the protein vaccine you mentioned. That's kind of our old standard, tried and true. Most of our vaccines are that. You take a viral protein and you oftentimes you hitch it to something else to cause an immune response or to improve the immune response, and then you inject it into the body and you make an immune response. So those are kind of an overview of the three types. And there are a number of protein-based COVID vaccines in development. They have not finished their phase 3 trials yet, so I haven't seen any data.
That's a wonderful overview. Thank you so much. One quick question regarding the vector vaccines. They would use a virus other than the one that causes COVID-19. Is that right?
Yeah, they use adenoviruses. So they're all adenoviral vectors that I'm aware of. I don't know, Jim, if you've seen anything else, but I think they're all adenoviruses.
Yeah, exactly. So the adenovirus is just a trick to be able to get the RNA inside the cell so that the cell factory can start producing the protein, which is what you want to be the target for the immune response.
Fantastic.
And Rachel, I just add to Kevin's wonderful answer that there are other types of vaccines that are being studied. I've seen 50 to 80 is the number of different vaccine prototypes that are under investigation. It's just that there are 3 to 5 that are leaders. But you could make a DNA vaccine. You could take a whole virus and make a vaccine. You can make a nasal spray vaccine. So those are some of the examples. And then Kevin mentioned the spike protein. And I think it would be wonderful if the listeners could understand the spike protein. So a virus has nucleic acid, either DNA or RNA, and eventually that gets translated into a protein. A virus makes proteins or tricks the cell into making proteins. And the way that this coronavirus is able to infect cells is like all other viruses. It needs to have a receptor on the cell. It's a lock and key like mechanism. So think of the virus as a key, and the cell is locked, but has openings where you could get in. And in order to fit into the lock, the virus has to make this spike protein. So the virus is a collection of many different proteins, but if you just, as shown by what Pfizer's doing and what the other companies are doing, is if you just, Moderna being the other company, if you just target that one spike protein, it seems in many, many instances to be sufficient to prevent the virus from getting into the cell and causing an infection.
That's great. Okay, thank you. And I know at the beginning you mentioned a couple of adverse reactions just reported today. I was wondering if you could just talk about the effectiveness and any adverse reactions reported so far with the front-runner vaccines.
Well, the 3 vaccines that have given some interim look at their phase 3 programs are the ones we mentioned. And all they've done is release press releases. So neither Jim or I or anyone else other than the UK regulatory body and now the FDA, I guess, has seen the data. So I can't really comment on a press release beyond, any more than you could, because that's what we read in the paper. So I don't know about the safety other than, some of the phase 1 and phase 2 data, some from earlier smaller trials have been published, and the safety looks fine. There's amount of reactogenicity, we call it reacto in the vaccine world. And these are, oh, my arm hurts, I got a fever, I felt achy, I felt flu-like for a day or two. Those kind of reactions we get with other vaccines, like Shingrix, for example, or even the flu vaccine sometimes. I mean, those kind of reactions we're seeing pretty good amounts of with these mRNA vaccines. They have probably more ability to cause those types of symptoms than, say, a regular flu vaccine, for example. In older people, it seems to be, they have a little bit less robust immune response and they have fewer of those reactions. But in younger individuals, we're seeing pretty large percentages of people having at least local reactions to the vaccine, much fewer having systemic reactions, but they do occur. So, if you go get vaccinated, it would not, I would take some paracetamol, that's what they call it in the UK, but Tylenol or ibuprofen before, just right after getting the vaccine around the time of that, it might help prevent some of those things, so.
And it's mostly just like fatigue, headache, little achiness at the injection site. Those are the kinds of things you're talking about.
Yeah, like I had a patient recently who they wanted to do the vaccine Friday. So, if they felt bad, they'd feel bad on Saturday. And I said, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't you do it Monday so you could get out of work Tuesday? Anyway, it's up to you how you value your time. But yeah, you might be not feel the greatest for 24 hours or something. But again, these are local and self-limited reactions, and we haven't seen the data from the phase 3 trials, but that's what I know from the smaller phase 2s, phase 1s.
Okay.
These are reactions that indicate that your immune system is working. That's what your immune system does, is it produces that achiness, the soreness, sometimes a fever. It's part of the immune response. So the people you worry about are the people who don't have a response like that.
I see. That's good context. And just to be crystal clear, none of these vaccines will make you sick with COVID-19. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct.
Yes, correct. No, they won't make you sick.
Now,
Exactly.
at least according to the press, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, one person developed a serious neurologic problem, and it's called transverse myelitis. It's an inflammation of the spinal cord. It can cause paralysis. It could be temporary and reversible. It's very rare. If you immunize 40,000 people, some rare events are bound to happen. So they initiated what was called a pause. And to the best of my knowledge, there's only been that one individual. And we still don't know whether it was coincidence or if we immunize 1 billion people, we're going to see a mini epidemic. That's always a concern.
Yeah, and I don't even think we know if it was in the vaccine group or the placebo group. I think only the safety monitoring committee, which is usually 3 or 4 people, know that information. So it may have been in the placebo group, and it's not even something to worry about. So we just don't know.
And that was just that one vaccine where that occurred. Is that right?
As best we know. And I think everyone understands the concept of a placebo, but it's obviously really important to know whether these vaccines work. And the only way to do that is to give some people a saltwater injection or an injection that really contains nothing that you think is active, as opposed to the mRNA or the adenoviral vaccine. So we call that dummy injection a placebo. And as Kevin said, everyone is blinded or masked. No one knows who got the placebo, who got the real immunization. So when a side effect's reported, it could well have been in someone who just got the placebo.
Right. So before we were just talking about, reactions people might have to the typical seasonal flu vaccine. We've had a number of questions from people who said that the flu vaccine typically makes them sick or causes inflammation in the body. So if somebody repeatedly has a reaction to the flu vaccine, Does that foretell a potential reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine? And should those people get vaccinated?
I'd say no. You don't know how it will predict your reaction to other vaccines. And the other thing is, like I said, it's not, you don't get the virus from the flu vaccine, just like you don't get the virus from the COVID vaccine. But you can have those self-limited flu-like reactions, we call them, for a day or two. So you do just have to put up with that. And like I said, some Tylenol or ibuprofen can help prevent those things.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Is it known whether any of the current vaccine trials included people living with spondyloarthritis or more broadly, people living with immune-mediated arthritis-type diseases? And have the trials included people who are on biologics?
No.
Exactly. So,
Maybe that some people got in with some of those diseases, but a lot of those diseases, those folks would have been excluded from the trial. But I've seen some of the protocols, they're written that if you have, you may have a chronic underlying condition, but it's well controlled and it's stable, that kind of thing. But most of the medicines that you're talking about, the biologics and whatnot, those were exclusionary for the trial. So to my knowledge, I don't know of those types of people being in the trials. Jim, do you know at all? I don't think so.
no, I think you're spot on. It would be very unusual for a company to include immunocompromised individuals in their initial trials. In general, they're looking for healthy individuals. We also don't know, for example, if someone's 80 or 90 and at greater risk for getting very ill from COVID, how many of them were included in the trials, but it's unlikely that there were very many.
So what people mainly want to know is, are the vaccines safe for people with spondyloarthritis and inflammatory arthritis conditions? How can we know that?
Go get one, find out.
Yeah, there's nothing, Rachel, about the biology of what's being injected to make us think that anyone with spondyloarthritis is at special risk. So as Kevin said, you're absolutely not going to get COVID from the vaccine. We are concerned that it will have less benefit or efficacy because your immune system is being suppressed. But fortunately, we have the world's expert with us, Dr. Winthrop, about how to perhaps circumvent that immunosuppression when you get vaccinated. But there's no a priori reason to believe that people with spondyloarthritis or people on immunosuppression are going to have more side effects from the vaccine.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I agree with Jim. And I mean, if anything, people who are immunosuppressed tend to have less side effects because they have less of that reactogenicity, similar to what we see with more older individuals. So I would suspect this group of people and other autoimmune, immune-mediated inflammatory diseases, they're probably going to tolerate the vaccine better, have less of that reactogenicity. And then the question is what Jim said is, are they going to mount as protective immune responses or not? And I think most of us would say they probably won't. I mean, that's what we see with all vaccines. I mean, the elderly and sometimes the super very young, the people who have less immunocompetency, quote, immune systems that aren't quite as strong and robust as they should be or were in an older time when they're younger, they just don't mount the same responses. So we see those same type of phenomenon with most immunosuppressants, not all of them, but a lot of it depends on the dose and the type of the drug. Most of the drugs that are used in this condition, some of them will probably dumb down the immune response to the vaccine. So it wouldn't surprise me if, eventually we figure out certain groups of people like this maybe need a higher dose or maybe need an extra booster dose, things like that, or a sooner dose, rather than a 2-year booster, maybe a 1-year booster instead. I mean, these are the things we figure out with time and additional studies.
So I think what Kevin is saying, if anything, someone with spondyloarthritis on medication is going to have less risk. The question is, will that same individual have less benefit? And I have a question, if you don't mind, that I'd like to ask Kevin, because Kevin studied
Please.
flu vaccine in people who are taking an immunosuppressive drug, methotrexate, which I assume that some people in the audience are probably taking. And Kevin carefully studied how best to maximize the response to the flu vaccine. And I'm wondering if he has some recommendations about whether our patients should withhold, for example, a TNF inhibitor prior to getting vaccinated with COVID.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like I said, I was talking about this in Leeds this morning, and also talking about it quite a bit with ACR, because ACR, the American College of Rheumatology, is forming a task force, a guidance group that I'll be part of to kind of address some of these questions. And a lot of the initial answers are going to be based on, our understanding of, studies like Jim just mentioned. How do these drugs affect our other vaccines where we have some data? So I don't know how they'll extrapolate to COVID vaccines yet until we actually have done some studies and have some data. And we're hoping to do that. We have a collaborative effort where we're going to do some studies to look at issues like what Jim just said. So in the flu trial he mentioned, we took half the people and just kept them on their methotrexate and gave them the flu vaccine. And the other half, we stopped their methotrexate that day. They got the vaccine for 2 weeks. And then we compared the immunogenicity, or the amount of immune response to the vaccine between those two groups. And what we found was, after say, 2-3 months, that the people who'd stopped their methotrexate for 2 weeks at the time of vaccination had a better immune response. It was not hugely better, but it was slightly better. It was better enough that it made me think that I would stop my methotrexate at the time of vaccination for 2 weeks. Now, whether that translates to other vaccines, we don't know. I mean, influenza is kind of a protein-based vaccine. Maybe that kind of idea translates more to a protein-based vaccine. I don't know how it translates to an mRNA vaccine or a vector vaccine, but certainly it's something that I'm going to study. We're going to do a study to answer the question. I think right now, that was the discussion this morning with Leeds, they're actually vaccinating. So they want to put a policy in place like today to say, hey, we're going to do it this way or that way. So we kind of don't know what the answer is, but I think about holding methotrexate for a couple of weeks. I think about holding JAK inhibitors for a couple of weeks. The TNF blockers, if you look at that literature across other vaccine types, you do see some effect usually, and you see some diminishment, particularly in the cell-mediated immunity parts of we have like two types of immunity. We have the antibody immunity, and we have that kind of more cell memory immunity. And you never know which one's more important with a specific virus until you test it out. And some viruses, one is more important than the other, and sometimes they're both important. And with COVID, we just don't know yet, frankly. So there may be some rationale in skipping a dose of a TNF blocker too, prior to receiving the vaccine. So I don't know that I would do that now, but that is something I'm planning to study because I think it's an open question. I guess my thought would be like, for now, like what if you don't do that, and we do a study this 8 months from now and show that you should do that? Well, like I said, you'll probably have the opportunity to get a booster at some point. And, I suspect the vaccines are going to provide some amount of protection for, 6 months or 12 months, maybe 2 years. We don't know yet. But even if you had somewhat a diminished response, I think you're going to have a decent level of protection now, and then an opportunity probably to boost it later.
That's wonderful.
Rachel, if the question is, how does a TNF inhibitor affect the immune response, you could do a pretty small study and just measure the antibody response, or as Kevin said, what we call the T-cell mediated response. But if the question is, how does the TNF inhibitor affect the immunity to the virus, you may need to study thousands of people in order to have enough cases of the virus. So the antibody response is what we call a surrogate endpoint. It's not the real endpoint. We want to show is that we want to determine whether or not you're equally protected against COVID. We probably won't study enough people to do that, but we'll study enough people to know how much antibody you make.
Hmm.
And then one day Kevin will tell us how much antibody you need to be protected.
Yeah. And then we'll be on to the next virus by then. So.
That's right.
I know, Dr. Winthrop, I know you have to hop off in a few minutes, so I just want to get to a few quick questions
Yeah,
for you
sure.
while you're here. We just had a question come in. You were just talking about an ACR task force. Do we have projected dates for when clinical guidance documents for vaccinations will be made available?
Yesterday.
Oh,
No, I don't know. We've just been formed and we're meeting this week. So I don't know. I'll have to wait. I'll have to ask the chairperson of the committee the same question, but I would anticipate in the next few weeks there'll be something. But
that's great. Thank you for your guidance on that. And then for the both of you, many are wondering if they should wait to get vaccinated in case even better vaccines come out in the future. What would you say to that? And would the both of you get the vaccine as soon as it becomes available?
I'll be first in line. 40 years ago, we discovered HIV and we still don't have a vaccine. We think that the flu vaccine is about 50% effective. The numbers for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine and even the AstraZeneca vaccine, really astoundingly good. I wouldn't wait for something better to come down the pike. And while there are unknowns about what the 2-year effect is going to be or the 20-year effect, for me personally, I think I'd rush to get vaccinated as soon as it's available.
yeah, I'd agree with that completely. I don't think you're not going to ever get better than 90%. So assuming that's real, which I think it probably is, I would absolutely. So again, FDA is looking at all that data, and they should be making a decision. I would be surprised if they decide any different than the UK regulators. I will say too, though, that these are interim results, and it's important the trials finish. And that means, they have to finish fully recruiting and full follow-up. And so, there is a confidence interval around that 90%. It might be 80%, it might be 95%, but I think suffice it to say, it's going to be high, and it's high enough that I would go ahead and go for it, because I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of benefit to waiting.
Kevin, do you mind if I ask you one other question?
Sure. Yeah.
So you said that these are interim results, which is obviously true. But if I had participated in the trial and taken the placebo, I'd want to know that, and I'd want to get the real vaccine as soon as possible. But of course, if we break the code, then we won't have the long-term data. How long do you think we have to wait before those who are in the placebo are entitled to get the real vaccine?
Well, it depends how, obviously, when those protocols were written, it wasn't envisioned that we'd have access to a vaccine. So, some of the protocols are different in terms of what they say. The bottom line is anybody who participates in a trial, of course, can leave at any time to go receive any therapy they want. So if there is a therapy on the market and it's available to you, you can go see it or go get it. And you also have the right, and most of the protocols I've seen, say that, if you're going to do that, we can unblind you and tell you whether you got placebo or not. So the companies should be able to tell you that. If you got placebo, it's an obvious decision. If you got the study vaccine, then you don't need to go get another vaccine as long as you got a study vaccine that has been shown to work, which so far the ones we've talked about are working. So, it is a problem, Jim, for the trials. I mean, I don't know another way to solve it necessarily, because we want long-term follow-up. And so I think what's going to happen is that, look, it's a pandemic. If people were in placebo, they should go get a vaccine if they can get it. I mean, we need to stop the pandemic. But it is going to complicate our understanding of long-term efficacy. So we're going to have to, have other studies to understand that, sub-studies of kind of groups that have already been vaccinated. But it's a different deal. I mean, the other thing is these are emergency use authorizations. These are not full approvals. So we're not normally used to that. We're normally used to getting access to a drug or a vaccine after it's been fully approved. So this isn't often an issue that comes up. So I think it's an important question. I get asked this by patients a lot. Should I participate in the, this trial or that trial? But what about if I have access to a vaccine? Doesn't that mess it up? And I guess what I'm still telling people is most of us aren't going to have access to a vaccine in the marketplace for probably at least 6 months. So there's still ample time to take part in a trial if you can. It helps science. It has a 50% chance of helping you because you might get the vaccine. And, still in 6 or 8 months, when you have access to another vaccine, you could opt out and get it at that time. But I think it is a challenge for the trials. There's no question.
You really think that the rollout will take 6 or 8 months? I'm more optimistic, but you're also more informed.
Well, I mean, I think there's issues with transport. There's issues with supply with the, Pfizer, Moderna. The AZ thing is, we don't know how that's going to play out still. And, it's going to be a tiered approach. So you're going to get it. I know you look like you're 50, but you're not. And so you're going to get it well before for me. And so it depends what group you're in. But if you're, older and you have obviously risk factors for badness, you're going to get it much sooner than someone who doesn't have those factors. So it depends who you are, but I think it's going to be on average, probably 5 or 6 months for most people to have an opportunity. So.
Yeah, Johnson & Johnson is probably next in the wings, and I'm optimistic that they'll announce really positive data similar to the AstraZeneca data in January. So.
Yeah, I am too. And that trial is just about closed. I mean, we're participating in it at OHSU, and I know there's only a few people left enrolled. So, listen, I have to go chair a data safety monitoring board meeting, and it's going to be really fun. I hate to break away, but thank you very much for having me, and sorry to leave early, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things, and I'm sure you can hammer Jim with the rest of your questions if there's any more. So.
No, I'm going to feel naked without you, Kevin.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
You bet. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Take care.
All right, so we're still here with Dr. Jim Rosenbaum, and we still have a lot more questions to get through. So let's just keep moving through those. Is it known how long immunity from these vaccines will last?
Yeah, that's easy. No, it's not known. Because as Kevin said, this is an emergency use authorization. We are rushing. And ordinarily, we would study a vaccine and wait months or years before it would be released. So we just don't have that follow-up data. We don't think that immunity is going to disappear quickly, but immunity varies. A tetanus vaccine, we say every 10 years, a pneumonia vaccine, we say every 5 years, and how a Shingrix vaccine for shingles, once you get the 2 vaccines and it lasts a lifetime. So we don't have the data, but we'll be able to monitor and advise if people need a booster in the future.
Yeah, because I heard someone asking, will this be a seasonal vaccine like the flu? And we just don't know that yet, right?
No, but the reason that the flu is seasonal is because the virus that causes the flu keeps changing. So the contents of the vaccine change. So the flu vaccine that you get in 2020 is different from the flu vaccine you got in 2019.
Right.
Coronavirus may mutate and make some changes, but as long as that spike protein, which is the target of virtually all the vaccines, as long as that spike protein is critical for the damage it does to us, we're okay with the same vaccine, and it shouldn't need to be repeated. But
that's good to know.
We'll see.
Yeah, that's good to know. There have been rare instances of reinfection reported after already having COVID-19. So is it possible to get COVID-19 even after receiving a vaccine?
Well, of course, because when the data come out and they say it's 90 or 95% effective, it means that it was 5 to 10% ineffective. So some people who were vaccinated did indeed become ill. AstraZeneca announced lower effectiveness than Moderna or Pfizer, but also said while some people got sick, no one got super sick. So the hope would be that even if it were partially effective, it would be sufficiently effective to prevent a fatal illness.
That's good. And could getting the vaccine cause you to test positive for COVID-19 on a test?
Absolutely not. No,
Great.
the PCR test, at least, there are antigen tests and antibody tests. So the nasal swab test, which is the one that's most commonly done, would not become positive by being immunized against the spike protein. If it's an antibody test looks to see if you've been exposed to the virus and if your body has made an immune response. So an antibody test, it would depend on what they're testing for. They're not testing for the infection, they're testing to see whether you were exposed to the infection. But all the antibody tests are not that reliable to begin with. So we're discouraging people in general from getting antibody tests to see if they're immune or have been exposed.
Oh, really? Interesting. I have a follow-up question to that. If you already have COVID-19 antibodies after being sick, should you still get vaccinated?
Well, that's a tough one, and no one knows. I think you recognize that some people who have had COVID supposedly became ill a second time. And that might mean that their immune response was poor, or maybe they, the virus is complicated. So the virus is multiple different antigens. And maybe if that spike protein is the really critical protein, maybe you didn't make a good enough immune response to that spike protein. So in that sense, the vaccine may be more protective than having had the infection itself. If I'd had the infection, I wouldn't be in a hurry to get the immunization. I don't think, it's hard to know from the press reports whether getting sick a second time is a 1 in 100,000 chance, or what's the numerator denominator. So I don't think I'd be in a hurry. I'd probably wait for a little more data to come out to see what would happen. And I certainly, if I had had COVID, let's say in November, I wouldn't want to get the vaccine 2 weeks after having the illness, because again, my immune response then is probably at its greatest, and boosting it might not be the best strategy.
I see.
I'm sorry to be vague. It's just that we don't have the data.
That makes perfect sense and very understandable. So I'd like to get into a little bit more detail specifically regarding spondyloarthritis. Earlier, we touched on whether people who are taking biologics, specifically TNF inhibitors, should get the vaccine. What about the IL-17 inhibitors? And as a follow-up question, would those taking biologics have to pause their biologic to take the COVID-19 vaccine? And if so, for how long? Is that known?
Right. So the IL-17 inhibitors, everything we said about the TNF inhibitors applies to the IL-17 inhibitors, that they are going to affect the immune response. You may have fewer symptoms after you get the vaccine, but that probably correlates with making a less robust immune response. Ask me the second part to the question, should we pause them?
Yes. Should people pause the biologic, and if so, for how long?
Yeah, so 15 minutes ago, there were two physicians, and one physician, namely me, was asking that of Kevin, right? Because Kevin does have the experience publishing about that with regard to the flu vaccine and showing that you could make a better antibody response by holding your methotrexate for a couple of weeks. we really don't know. And I'd like to think that the immune response is going to be good enough that you don't need to pause. It's really an individualized piece of advice that I'll give to patients. So I have patients who are taking a TNF inhibitor, let's say every 2 weeks, and 10 days after they've had that TNF inhibitor, they know that they want it again. And other patients who are taking it every 2 weeks and can go 3 weeks or 4 weeks, or stop it before a surgery and know that they don't need it right at that 2-week mark. So if you're in that latter group where your body does fine with a little longer duration between the injections, I would stretch out that time and try to wait a little bit before try to maximize the time from your TNF inhibitor until you get the immunization. And then try also to delay a little bit getting the TNF inhibitor after the immunization, because that's a critical time for your immune response. On the other hand, if there's someone who says, boy, doctor, I wish I could get my adalimumab every 7 days instead of every 14 days, I'd probably say, well, just, go ahead and take it, and let's take our chances. And if worse comes to worse, as Dr. Winthrop said, maybe you're going to need a third immunization to really boost your immune response. So,
But they should still get it.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. I just want to back up a little bit. SAA has covered this question before, but it's always helpful to discuss for new audiences. Are people with spondyloarthritis at greater risk for getting COVID-19 or for having more severe disease? And what about being HLA B27 positive? Does that gene affect a person's susceptibility?
Okay, so those are great questions. And the SAA has really been a world leader in trying to develop the data to answer those questions. And we did it by posting a survey on the SAA website. I think we've had roughly 4,000 respondents. As best we can tell, there's been no increased risk of getting COVID just by virtue of having spondyloarthritis. And we've published that there's no increased risk by taking a biologic like a TNF inhibitor or an IL-17 inhibitor. There may be an increased risk if you're taking prednisone at a moderate to high dose, but most of our patients with spondyloarthritis are not doing that. And by the way, timing is critical. So dexamethasone is a first cousin to prednisone, and dexamethasone seems to reduce the mortality from COVID if it's given to a select group of hospitalized patients who are ventilator dependent. So early on, if you compromise your immune system, as with dexamethasone, you might be more susceptible, but later it might be a good idea to compromise your immune system because your immune system itself is doing some of the damage that we recognize as COVID. So kind of a complicated answer. Different immunosuppressives affect the body's response to COVID differently. And the only one we know that seems to be a danger right now would be prednisone. And I'd say doses of greater than 7.5 milligrams a day in terms of increasing your susceptibility. And then you asked a question about B27, which is a really fascinating question. So I think most of the listeners will know the term HLA B27, but that's the genotype, the tissue type that predisposes to spondyloarthritis. So the majority of individuals with ankylosing spondylitis have HLA B27. The majority of patients with axial spondyloarthropathy have HLA B27, but you can still get either disease and be B27 negative. B27 is like a blood type, but there only are 4 blood types, A, B, AB, or none of the above, which is O. Whereas for HLA, there are literally millions of tissue types. it's really, really unusual for a gene to have multiple different choices, which we call alleles, multiple different alleles. And when there are multiple alleles, we call that polymorphisms. The HLA system is the most polymorphic system in the body, right? There's no other system where your HLA-B type could be any one of 1,000 different choices. And of course, you have an A type and a C type and a D type and a DP, DR, DQ. It's really complicated when you start multiplying these out. So why is that? Why is it so diverse? And we don't know for sure, but we think it's so diverse in humans and in whales and in fish, so that there's no pandemic that's going to come along and wipe out the species. The species has a selective advantage in being diverse. There are certain genes that protect you against malaria. Those are the genes that cause sickle cell anemia. So if you live in Africa where there's a lot of malaria, you may be protected by carrying the gene for sickle cell anemia. Whereas if you live in North America where there's no malaria, it's a disadvantage. We think that B27 probably protects a little bit against hepatitis C and a little bit against HIV. As best we can tell, and the SAA has published this based on our survey, being B27 positive was neutral when it came to COVID-19. It didn't make it less likely to get it or more likely, and it didn't make it more severe or less severe. But it would be nice to study 100,000 people instead of the 3,000 to 4,000 people whom we were able to study by the survey.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the survey. It's been going on for much of 2020. We're still enrolling people in this study, studying the interaction between spondyloarthritis and COVID-19. So we're going to be posting the link to that survey in the comments, and we encourage everyone interested to please sign up for that survey and take part in what is the only longitudinal survey studying the effects of COVID-19 specifically on the SPA population.
Right.
And you are the principal investigator, and we're so glad that you've been here to share your results with us.
Well, we started the survey because we had no data. So our patients desperately wanted the information. And we started the survey for a selfish reason, and that is so that we could give an authoritative answer to our patients. And we were concerned because some of the drugs that we give, for example, make herpes zoster, the virus that causes shingles, more likely to occur. And we were worried that this would affect susceptibility to a virus. And we're thrilled with the answer that we came up with, and other people are finding a very similar answer. So the TNF inhibitors are used for other diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. And the answer seems to be the same, that it doesn't seem to put you at risk for COVID.
That's great. Will people with spondyloarthritis or other related immune-mediated diseases be considered in a higher risk category, meaning they'll be in a higher priority category when it comes to who can get the vaccine first?
We're waiting, right? So tomorrow's a big meeting where this emergency use authorization will hopefully occur for the Pfizer vaccine. And then they'll begin to distribute the vaccine, and there won't be enough for everyone to get it on the first go round. The government, the rumor is that healthcare providers and nursing home residents will get first priority. I think the data show that people who are immunocompromised, except for those who are prednisone dependent, are not really at huge increased risk. But I think that the government will say that those who have an immune-mediated disease, such as spondyloarthritis, would constitute a special population, and they will get some priority. But we don't know the answer, and rheumatologists may not be the ones who make up the rules.
Right. I want to ask a couple of questions that are coming in live. Are there any possible conflicts between the vaccine and common drugs used to treat AS? I know we spoke about the TNF inhibitors, the IL-17 inhibitors. Can you speak any further about that?
So, as Kevin and I said earlier, we think that drugs that suppress your immune system are likely to reduce the efficacy or effectiveness of the vaccine because you're going to make a smaller immune response. But in terms of having more side effects or more risk from the vaccine, no. It's not a live vaccine. You're not going to get COVID from the vaccine, that's for sure.
That's great. And another person asks, if they've had an anaphylactic reaction to another vaccine, should they be wary about this one?
Well, so it was new information for me when Kevin said that there had been some anaphylactic reactions this morning in England.
Mm-hmm.
But the material that's being used to produce the vaccine should be quite different, I think, from the way a flu vaccine is produced. So I don't think that there should be a cross-reactivity between your response to the flu vaccine and to the COVID vaccine. Furthermore, anaphylaxis is a type of immune response, which means that you've been exposed to the antigen before. So I was really surprised that someone getting the first shot would have an anaphylactic reaction. Having an anaphylactic reaction to the second shot would make more sense because then you've been immunized and you've got the antibodies that could trigger anaphylaxis. So sometimes doctors talk about an anaphylactoid reaction, which is not true anaphylaxis. When I was 10, my dad was a doctor. I went to his office to get, I don't know what vaccine, and I fainted, which is not unusual. It wasn't anaphylaxis. It was the worry of a 10-year-old about someone getting a needle in his arm. So could the anaphylaxis this morning have been someone fainting from anxiety or whatever? I don't, Obama and Bush and Clinton, I think, are going to get their vaccinations live on television. I don't envy them that they have to perform like that. A lot of people have a certain anxiety about a needle being stuck in the arm. So you might want to take some Tylenol, as Kevin said, before the vaccine. Obviously, the vaccine is going to be given in a medical office where you can wait and be observed, and epinephrine's on hand if you have a reaction. But we'll wait to hear more information about these suspected anaphylactic reactions that were reported this morning.
Sounds good. And another question, can you speak to whether the COVID-19 vaccines might cause flares or increase the risk of flares in people with spondyloarthritis?
So great question. 40 some years ago when I started my training, we thought that the flu vaccine would trigger lupus. The thinking was that lupus was an autoimmune type disease, and a vaccination is meant to stimulate your immune system, and therefore lupus might flare up. But as we got more data, I think that that's been refuted. And it's very unlikely that a targeted immune response is going to make your disease worse. Really extremely unlikely. We use the term autoimmune disease a little bit loosely. Autoimmune would mean that your body's making an immune response against the self. And in spondyloarthritis, it's possible that, say, a bacterial antigen got into your joint space, and it's not the self, it's something in the environment that you're making an immune response. We don't typically find autoantibodies in spondyloarthritis. So I wouldn't think of spondyloarthritis as an autoimmune disease. It's rather a dysregulated immune response, and that dysregulation shouldn't be worsened by getting immunized.
That's good to know. Earlier you and I were discussing the risks versus benefits of getting vaccinated and how vaccines have really transformed our lives. And I think it's just worth remembering what you were saying about how vaccines are so effective against so many devastating diseases such as polio, smallpox, measles, things like that.
Yes. Nothing has impacted life expectancy as much as the success of vaccines. Boy, I would not have wanted to be living 500 years ago when epidemics would wipe out large segments of the population. We've come a long way, even compared to the 1918 flu epidemic. It's amazing that we were able to create a vaccine. I say we, the medical scientific community. It truly was a scientific feat. It was something like 48 hours from the time that the virus RNA was sequenced until they were able to get the RNA that they were able to start testing in a vaccine. That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So vaccines have really profoundly affected our quality of life. It's amazing.
Right. So even though there is a risk of some side effects, the benefits outweigh the risk, in your opinion.
Precisely. I mean, it's probable that some people who got flu vaccine had a neurologic complication called Guillain-Barré. But it's so rare, and even though flu is usually not fatal, the benefit from the flu vaccine far outweighs the risk, as an example. And in this, where the efficacy is better than flu vaccine, we think, and the risk from COVID is greater than with flu, I don't think there's any, as I said, I want that vaccine for myself and for my family as soon as I can.
Right. And how long does it take for the shot to start working? I know they say for the flu virus, it takes about 2 weeks for it to become effective.
So in 2 weeks, and if we give a human or a laboratory animal a vaccine, they've made a pretty good immune response in 2 weeks. The little bit of data that I've heard, and again, as Kevin said, a lot of the information is pretty much under wraps still, is that at least with the AstraZeneca vaccine, within 3 weeks, there was excellent immunity. And all the vaccines that have been trialed so far are recommending a booster that's usually at 28 days. But by 3 weeks, I wouldn't recommend going to a party where there are people who are COVID infected. I wouldn't recommend not wearing a mask. I wouldn't recommend avoiding social distancing. I mean, again, it's 95%. That still means that there's some risk. But I will feel more confident 3 weeks after I get that first shot.
Right. That's good. Yeah. And somebody just asked live, if you receive a vaccine, can you still transmit the virus to another person? So since it's not 100% effective, the answer to that would be possibly, correct?
Possible is right, but the possibility should be markedly diminished.
Great. Okay. Well, it seems that we've come to the end of our hour. So I just want to revisit quickly. I know earlier we talked about in broad terms, if the COVID-19 vaccine will be safe for people with spondyloarthritis. Can people with spondyloarthritis get this vaccine? What would you say as a closing thought?
I'd say that vaccines are wonderful, that science has achieved an incredible feat by bringing us an effective set of vaccines so quickly. And while there are unknowns, is there going to be something that's going to happen a decade from now? Possibly, but all we know about the science is reassuring. And I would recommend to my patients, and as I said, to my family and to myself, get that vaccine as soon as you're eligible.
Thank you so much for your time and expertise today, Dr. Rosenbaum.
Thank you. Rachel.
This has been invaluable, and thank you everybody for spending your time with us today and tuning in. We're all working to stay informed and educated, and we hope this event was helpful for you. Please reach out to SAA anytime if you have questions, and thank you again for being with us. This has been wonderful.
And thanks to the SAA for asking me to participate.
Our pleasure to have you. All right, take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.